The Crusades, the ugliest religious war in history. Part 1, Blood and Faith. Imagine this. The year is 1095. A pope stands before thousands of fervent believers, his voice echoing across a field in France. With words that will unleash 2 centuries of bloodshed, he declares, Deus vult, God wills it. What followed was not the holy war they promised, but perhaps the most shameful chapter in medieval history. This is the story of the Crusades. 8 devastating campaigns that began as a mission to reclaim the Holy Land, but devolved into something far more sinister. It is a story of how religious devotion became a mask for greed, how holy warriors became barbarians, and how the pursuit of heaven on earth created a living hell. Chapter 1, the holy city that changed everything. Our story begins not with war, but with a city, Jerusalem, a name that has echoed through history for over 3,000 years. To understand why millions would die for this ancient city, we must understand what it meant to 3 great religions. For Jews, it was the site of Solomon's temple, the heart of their ancient kingdom. For Christians, it was where their Savior died and rose again, with the Church of the Holy Sepulchre marking the very spot of Christ's crucifixion. But Jerusalem held equal significance for Muslims. It was here that the Prophet Muhammad, they believed, ascended to heaven in his miraculous night journey. Along with Mecca and Medina, Jerusalem was one of the 3 holiest cities in Islam. For centuries, this shared reverence created an unusual harmony. Christian pilgrims journeyed freely to pray at Christ's tomb. Muslim rulers collected modest taxes and maintained order. It was an imperfect peace, but it was peace nonetheless. That balance was about to shatter. Chapter 2, the spark that lit the fire. In the year 1071, everything changed. The Seljuk Turks, a rising Islamic power from Central Asia, swept through Anatolia like a storm. They crushed the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert, even capturing the emperor himself. Worse still for Christians, they seized Jerusalem and closed its gates to pilgrims. Suddenly, the holiest site in Christendom was beyond reach. The Byzantine emperor, desperate and humiliated, sent urgent pleas westward. Help us, he said, or watch all of Christendom fall to the infidel. In Rome, Pope Urban II received these desperate messages. But the Pope had problems of his own. The Catholic Church was fracturing. The Great Schism of 1054 had split Christianity between East and West. Urban's authority was constantly challenged by the Holy Roman Emperor. He needed something dramatic, something that would unite all Christians under his banner. The emperor's plea gave him exactly what he needed. Chapter 3, the speech that launched 1,000 deaths. On November 27, 1095, at the Council of Clermont in southern France, Pope Urban II addressed a crowd of nobles, clergy, and commoners. He declared that an accursed race had invaded the lands of Christians and depopulated them by sword, pillage, and fire. He called on his audience to end their quarrels, lay down their arms against one another, and take up the cross. Take the road to the Holy Sepulchre, he said. Wrest that land from the wicked race and subject it to yourselves. The crowd erupted. Deus vult, God wills it, echoed across Europe. Urban then offered a reward that would prove catastrophic. Complete forgiveness of sins for anyone who joined the cause. In an age terrified of eternal damnation, this was the ultimate prize. What the Pope had unleashed was beyond his control. Chapter 4, the People's Crusade, a march to massacre. Before the official armies could even organize, something unexpected happened. A charismatic hermit named Peter inspired thousands of peasants, women, and children believed that God himself was calling them to Jerusalem. Armed with little more than farming tools and blind faith, they set out in the spring of 1096. They never stood a chance. Starving, diseased, and completely unprepared for war, they were slaughtered almost to the last when they reached Turkish territory. Of the 100,000 who began the journey, fewer than 3,000 made it back to Constantinople. But this disaster was only the beginning. Chapter 5, the real Crusaders, Knights of the Cross. While the peasants died in Anatolia, the real crusade began to assemble. These were not desperate farmers, but professional warriors. Norman knights from France and Italy, hardened fighters trained from birth for war. Clad in chainmail, bearing shields marked with crosses, riding war horses bred for battle. They looked like God's own army. The Byzantine emperor, who had only asked for a few thousand auxiliaries, was shocked by what he saw. In 1097, they crossed into enemy territory. Their destination was the city of Nicaea. But the noble goal of freeing the Holy Land quickly began to twist into something darker. When Nicaea fell, the Crusaders discovered the Byzantines had secretly negotiated the city's surrender. They were denied the pillage they had expected. Trust began to fracture, and with it, the last restraints on their behavior. Chapter 6, Antioch, where heroes became monsters. The siege of Antioch lasted 8 months and transformed the Crusaders forever. The city's walls stretched 10 kilometers and bristled with hundreds of towers. The Crusaders, after months of futile attacks, were starving and desperate. When they finally captured the city through bribery, they unleashed their rage. They massacred everyone: Muslim civilians, Christian residents who had lived peacefully under Islamic rule, even children. The streets ran red with blood. Then came something even more horrifying. Trapped inside the city by a Muslim counterattack, with no food left, the Crusaders began to eat the dead. A contemporary account describes it with chilling clarity. Adults among the pagans were fed to cattle. Children were roasted on skewers. Flesh was cut from the dead and eaten, sometimes before it was even cooked. These were supposed to be God's soldiers. Instead, they had become something out of a nightmare. Chapter 7, the sacred spear and the road to Jerusalem. Just when hope seemed lost, a monk claimed to discover the Holy Lands. The spear that pierced Christ's side, buried beneath Antioch's cathedral. Whether real or not, the find reignited the Crusaders' spirit. Believing they carried divine power, they charged from the city and scattered the Muslim army. But the trail of destruction they left behind told a darker story. In the Syrian town of Massacre, they once again turned to cannibalism. Chroniclers describe them cutting up Muslim corpses with saws, searching for swallowed gold coins. The Crusaders had lost their humanity on the road to salvation. Chapter 8, Jerusalem. The city of God becomes a slaughterhouse. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders finally reached the walls of Jerusalem. The siege was short and brutal. When the walls fell, the Crusaders stormed the city with a fury unmatched in medieval history. They killed everyone: Muslims, Jews, even Eastern Christians who looked different from themselves. Islamic sources claim 70,000 died. Even Crusader accounts admit to over 10,000. At the Temple Mount, they waded through blood up to their ankles. Jews were herded into synagogues and burned alive. Infants were smashed against stone walls. And all the while, they sang hymns and praised God. When the killing ended, the survivors stood among the ruins of a sacred city. Jerusalem was theirs. But at what cost? Chapter 9. The Crusader states, kingdoms built on blood. With victory came new challenges. The Crusaders divided the land into 4 states: the county of Edessa, the principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the kingdom of Jerusalem. To defend these new territories, they created military orders: the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, and later the Teutonic Knights. Warrior monks who took vows of poverty and obedience while wielding swords in God's name. For a time, it seemed they had succeeded. Jerusalem was Christian once more, but enemies were watching. Chapter 10, the rise of Saladin. In 1144, the tide began to turn. Muslim forces recaptured Edessa, and then came the rise of one man who would change everything. Saladin, a disciplined, honorable, and deeply devout Muslim leader. Saladin united the fractured Islamic world. From Egypt, he built a force dedicated to retaking Jerusalem. In 1187, at the Battle of Atin, he crushed the Crusader army. Jerusalem fell again, but unlike the Crusaders 88 years earlier, Saladin spared the civilians. His mercy stood in stark contrast to Christian brutality. The news sent shockwaves through Europe. The Pope called for another crusade. 3 kings answered the call: Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip Augustus of France, and Richard the Lionheart of England. Chapter 11, when kings go to war. Never before had such power sailed for the Holy Land. But human frailty undermined their might. Frederick Barbarossa drowned crossing a river. His army collapsed. Philip Augustus and Richard Lionheart captured the port city of Acre. But their rivalry tore their alliance apart. Philip returned to France. Richard was left to fight alone. Richard won battles. He was brave and ruthless, but he saw the truth. Even if he took Jerusalem, he could never hold it. The distances were too great, the logistics impossible. In 1192, he signed a treaty with Saladin. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims could visit freely. After nearly a century of war, they had come full circle. But the cost was staggering. Closing of Part 1. We have seen how the noblest of intentions can lead to the darkest of deeds. The First Crusade began with prayers and ended in cannibalism. The Third Crusade, led by Europe's greatest kings, changed almost nothing despite enormous sacrifice. But even these horrors were only the beginning. In Part 2 of this story, Crusaders would forget Jerusalem entirely. They would turn their swords against fellow Christians. They would sack Christian cities, and the crusading ideal would become a grotesque shadow of itself. How did a call to serve God become a license for humanity's worst instincts? That is a question we are still grappling with today. End of Part 1. Thank you for listening. This was Hugh from World History Marathon. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe and hit that like button.